I mean, I've heard hundreds of millions of hits actually for people trying to access tickets. But it was pretty overwhelming, I've got to say.
Picture this. Jimmy Page sits alone late at night, guitars watching him from the walls like silent judges. The room feels tense, almost hostile. For a moment, it sounds like he's about to name just one band, the one history got wrong. But that pause is a trap, because the truth is darker. It was never one mistake. It was four. Four bands pushed aside by ego, timing, and louder names that rewrote the story. And the first name that rises in Page's mind is one that still makes him uneasy: the Rolling Stones. This one is uncomfortable, and Page knows it. The Stones were never supposed to be called underrated, not with the fame, the headlines, the longevity. On paper, they won. But Page saw something rotting beneath the legend. A band whose image devoured its musicianship, whose mythology slowly erased the work itself. Swagger became louder than sound. Scandal became more memorable than structure. Critics stopped listening and started myth-making, and Page felt the imbalance grow year after year. The rivalry was never shouted. It was colder than that. Zeppelin chased power, danger, myth built on precision. The Stones chased danger too, but wrapped it in attitude and chaos. The world applauded the pose and forgot to question the craft. And that disturbed Page. Because what does it say about history when survival matters more than substance? When being iconic outweighs being exact? When noise replaces depth? The Stones weren't underrated by success. They were underrated by respect. And the question still hangs, sharp and uneasy. Did the world celebrate the band, or just the idea of them? That uneasy thought pulls Page further back in time to where everything really began, before myths, before empires, before anyone knew what rock was supposed to sound like. This is where the memory sharpens. The Yardbirds. This one cuts deeper than Page ever admits, and it still burns. The Yardbirds were innovators before innovation was fashionable, before distortion was accepted, before risk was rewarded. They twisted blues into something sharper and more dangerous, something the industry didn't yet have language for. But instead of being crowned pioneers, they were quietly rewritten out of the story. History reduced them to a footnote, a stepping stone for bigger legends, when in truth, they were the laboratory where ideas were born. Sounds that later shook stadiums were first tested in cramped clubs during chaotic rehearsals that barely paid the rent. Page watched those ideas walk away wearing someone else's name. There was resentment here, not loud, not public, but corrosive. A slow, gnawing anger that came from seeing former bandmates and successors build empires on foundations the Yardbirds poured and were never credited for. The world celebrated the result, but forgot the experiment. And that is where the unease lives. Because if the Yardbirds were so crucial, so ahead, so influential, why were they the ones erased?
Because if you listen to the music, you'll hear how expertly it's played. And look, you can have one virtuoso musician.
Page's thoughts move forward again, not to another legend, but to a band slowly worn down by comparison and quiet neglect. Humble Pie suffered from comparisons they never asked for, and that was the first betrayal. Every article framed them against louder, flashier bands, as if raw hunger was a flaw. Every album was judged by standards that were never theirs to meet, rules written for someone else to win. What made it worse was how quietly it happened. No scandal, no explosion, just slow erasure. While safer, more marketable acts were lifted up, Humble Pie were left grinding on the road night after night, bleeding their truth into half-filled rooms. Page watched it unfold with growing unease. He respected their grit because it reminded him of something dangerous: music before polish, instinct before strategy. And Tagore had scared the industry. You couldn't package humble pie. You couldn't soften them without killing what made them real. They played harder as the walls closed in, toured relentlessly, refused to bend, and still they were pushed aside, quietly replaced by bands that asked less and gave less. That kind of injustice doesn't fade. It festers. Page never forgot it, because it forced a question he still doesn't like answering. What happens to real bands when the world decides honesty is a liability? The Beatles. This one borders on heresy, and Page knows it. The Beatles were worshipped, canonized, untouchable. Their story became scripture, their music, unquestionable truth. But Page believed that their shadow grew so large it swallowed everything around it. Not by malice, by momentum. Their dominance didn't just shape history, it flattened it. Innovation was credited to them first, even when ideas were already hanging in the air, waiting to be claimed. Bands who followed weren't heard on their own terms. They were measured, reduced, dismissed as imitators, no matter how original, no matter how dangerous. Page watched this happen in real time. He saw journalists reach for the same comparisons again and again. He saw nuance disappear, risk erased, complexity simplified into a single narrative that was easy to sell and impossible to challenge. And that's where the discomfort lives. Because if the Beatles were truly so far ahead of everyone else, why did so many other brilliant bands vanish in their wake? The Beatles weren't underrated. They were overcorrected by history at the expense of everyone else. And once that thought settles, there's nowhere left for Page's mind to run. No more names, no more comparisons, only the weight of what all of it means. Page leans back, fingers resting on an old guitar neck, the wood worn smooth by decades of ambition and frustration. He's lived long enough to see how fame really works, and how easily it lies when history needs a clean story. These fluid bar bands weren't underrated by accident. They were inconvenient. They didn't fit the narrative. They didn't play safe. They challenged comfort, refused formulas, and stood too close to the fire while others learned how to package danger and sell it back to the world. And for that, they paid the price. Page has watched talent be ignored while image was rewarded. He's seen depth lose to timing, originality crushed by marketing, and truth buried under noise. Success, he knows now, is rarely about who burns brightest. It's about who survives the longest without making anyone uncomfortable. And that leaves a question hanging in the air, one that still unsettles him. Was history ever really about greatness, or just about who learned how to be loud at the right moment? Because the real legends, the ones who mattered most, are often the ones left behind. There is one last thought Page can't shake, darker than all the rest. It creeps in slowly, quietly, like feedback humming just before an amp screams, a realization that poisons admiration and turns it into something closer to disgust. Because if these bands were ignored, erased, rewritten, or quietly pushed aside, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't timing. It was a system working exactly as designed, a machine that rewards obedience, punishes depth, and crushes anything that refuses to be simplified or controlled. Page knows this machine intimately. He negotiated with it, fought it, used it when he had to, and survived it by being just dangerous enough to be profitable. Others weren't so lucky. They were chewed up, drained of ideas, and discarded once their usefulness ended. History, Page has learned, doesn't like resistance. It likes its heroes clean, its stories easy, its legends repeatable. It prefers mythology over truth, image over craft, comfort over confrontation. It doesn't like bands that ask difficult questions. It doesn't like artists who refuse to soften the edges. Those bands made people uneasy. They challenged the listener instead of pleasing them. And for that they were punished, quietly, efficiently, permanently. So the final question hangs there now, heavier than any chord Page ever played, sharper than any solo he ever bent into shape. How many great bands were never truly heard, not because they failed, but because they refused to be convenient?